Together we learn, together we grow, together we heal, together we flow. Be cool, every teacher, every school. 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 Be cool.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Todd Chul. I serve as the lead learner for the SCEA, Center for Educator Wellness and Learning. We call ourselves Cool. You can find out more about us at cool.us. That's CEWL.us. And of course, we're thankful to NEA for providing us with a GPS grant that brings you all the things that we're doing at Cool. And of course, as the state affiliate, the SCEA is the state affiliate for the NEA, and you can join that state affiliate, the only union for educators in South Carolina. Join the scea.org. And of course, the SCEA is open to not only classroom teachers, but to education support professionals, to bus drivers, cafeteria workers, custodial workers. In fact, we're going to be at the Education Support Professionals Conference this Saturday in Columbia. If you're going to that, I'm looking forward to seeing you. We'll be talking about mindfulness-based stress reduction. So if you're in that session coming up Saturday, I'll see you then. Tonight, we are going to be talking about, it's very timely, we're going to be talking to Derek Black. And Derek is a professor of law at the University of South Carolina, go Gamecocks, School of Law, and he directs the Constitutional Law Center there. He's one of the nation's foremost expert in education law and policy. He offers expert witness testimony in school funding, voucher, and federal policy litigation, including in voucher litigation right here in South Carolina. His research is routinely cited in federal courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court. He's also a regular commentator and op-ed contributor in major media outlets on issues like the future of the Department of Education. His 2020 book, Schoolhouse Burning, Public Education and the Assault on American Democracy, warned that new education trends represented a retreat from our nation's foundational commitments to democracy and public education. He has a new book. That book is called Dangerous Learning, The South's Long War on Black Literacy. It explores the connection between the criminalization of Black literacy and freedom of thought in the 19th century to today's attacks on racial equity, racial history, and public education itself. Ladies and gentlemen, here is Derek Black. How are you doing tonight, Derek?
I'm doing well, Todd. Glad to be here with you. Thank you for making time for me to be part of this.
I appreciate it. So, you're here at a timely, you and I, before we went on, talked about the fact that they're looking at this Senate Bill 62. I know neither of us have expertise over the details of the bill, but I do, in your bio, I know that you're familiar with vouchers and sort of the history of, where they're coming from, what the sort of motivation is for these vouchers, and the problematic nature in terms of their constitutionality. Let's just start there, not digging into S62 necessarily, but into the idea of vouchers. What are your thoughts on these voucher schemes that they've been relentless in trying to pass for decades?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say there's a historical part and then there's a modern part. I mean, the historical part, which I always try to remind legislators of, and did it in some of the briefs that I submitted in the last Supreme Court case, was that, look, our commitment to public education goes back to 1868 in this state, right? That in the aftermath of the Civil War and the ashes of war, we believed we needed to create a public education system that lifted us to a real democracy, right? It lifted, hundreds of thousands of formerly enslaved people in this state into citizenship. And it also lifted a lot of white folks. Illiteracy was 4 times higher in the South than in the North prior to the Civil War, right? So this this commitment to public education is old, and I can say nothing but good things about at least our original intentions, even if we didn't properly implement it every step of the way. But our commitment to that program means that the state needed to devote all of its resources and all of its efforts to that and not get distracted in the private sector, right? To not let people come running to the state house for money that would ultimately come out of our public schools. And so we put a provision in our state constitution that prohibited the funding of private education. And it has been there for over a century. And that doesn't seem to matter to the
Right.
legislature, that they don't care what the Constitution says. They are caught up in this immediate moment of politics where they just want what they want. They want talking pieces, they want, sound bites and bullet points. And I should say they even want it, notwithstanding the fact that their voters don't want it. I mean, that's the thing. You look around in lots of other states, ruby red states, and you still have 2 out of 3 voters that oppose vouchers. And so there's also a disconnect between the Republican legislature and the Republican voter. And
Right.
put the Constitution away. There's a disconnect between what people want and what the legislature is doing. So, to me, this is frustrating. 6 ways to Sunday.
Neil Collins, who's a representative or a senator, I can't remember, from Pickens, I believe, Pickens, wrote a really powerful social media post earlier this week, just sort of outlining exactly what it's costing our local school districts, and sort of the way the money's being funneled to purchase, say, computers and things like that, and it's really going to cause harm to the public system. It seems obvious to many of us that there's this conflict. I've made the analogy to try to sort of take it away from this sort of argument around woke and the schools are indoctrinating, to like just have it. Let's look at another sector. So your public school library, your public library in your town. Imagine if I went into the public library and they didn't have the book that I wanted, and I said, out of your budget, I need you to give me a $50 coupon to go buy whatever I want at Barnes and Nobles, but I don't want any accountability. I'm not going to give you my receipt. I'm just going to have it in my account and I'm going to go spend it. I can go to the cafeteria, get a coffee. I can buy a magazine, a cracked magazine. I can buy a book, whatever. And there's really no accountability for how that money's spent. I think anybody would say that's eventually going to gut the library's budget, A, and B, like, that's not appropriate to give public tax dollars to a company like Barnes and Noble, or to a person who wants to go spend money. If I don't like what they have to offer at my public school library, I can use my own funds and go to Barnes and Noble or Amazon and buy a book, or I can request that book be added. But I think when people just look at it in a common sense way, they see this sort of conflict that public tax dollars going to private entities just doesn't make sense.
Well, let me. I can't help since you told me we were on the lighter side here. They still sell cracked magazines.
Yeah. I honestly don't know.
They're dating both of us. I knew what you were talking about,
I know.
and probably our listeners did. But
Yeah.
yeah, no, I think you're right on the spot. In fact, one guy, I don't remember who it was, made a similar analogy, but I think it struck home even more to me. The analogy, he said, look, you know our national parks are national treasures, and they cost what they cost. But for the people who don't want to go to the national park, would we give them vouchers to go to Disney World? I mean, I'm not anti Disney World, but at the end of
Right.
the day, that national park is a treasure. It costs a certain amount to maintain and manage, regardless of whether somebody who wants to go to Disney World or not shows up. But ultimately, we're at this situation now where that's what folks want. They want their Disney World ticket, and so the math just doesn't add up. I mean, the other thing I would note, and this is getting maybe more wonky than people want at 7 o'clock in the evening, but no matter where the money comes from, right? They'll say, well, we're going to fund. Originally, they were going to fund it out of the scholarship program, right? Then now they're going to fund it out of general revenue, and they say, well, we're not taking it out of the education budget. But here's the thing, right? The amount of money that each public school receives is a function of the head count, right? And so the fewer heads that are there, the less money the state is going to give them in the public schools. Now, others will say, but wait a minute, you don't need as much money if you don't have as many students. Well, that's not true. And the educators know this as well, because, the temperature, the heaters are going to run just as much in our South Carolina schools. The AC is going to run just as much. It doesn't matter whether there's 10
Right.
kids or 1,000 kids in there. The buses still have to run the same routes. You still got the same number of principals. And unless you lose so many teachers that you're going to collapse schools and combine with another school, you got to maintain the same number of teachers. And so, this idea that students going elsewhere is going to save the school's money, it just isn't true. And the simple way we talk about it's fixed costs. There's certain costs that just do not go away. They're there no matter what. And so I have serious concerns, particularly with our rural communities, right? I mean, I think they're the
Mhm.
ones that are most at risk. You have an elementary school with one grade, with one teacher per grade. Like there's nowhere to go down from there, right? And so ultimately, those institutions could collapse if you've got out of town virtual school vultures coming in trying to get people to sign up for online private school, which is happening in other places as well.
Yeah, and it doesn't, when they say, well, we want to promote choice, like you said, even a lot of these rural districts, there really isn't much of a choice. There might be like a Christian school that's 20 miles from a person's house. If there's no transportation, if there's no special ed services, if they say we don't want to let this person in because they don't align with our religious views, there's really not much of a choice. So um, I don't understand how people can't see this just as a fundamental American thing, that we have a public school and those public schools take in all students. We don't deny students based on their religion or their sexual orientation or their whether they're pregnant or not, or what they believe in. Like, we accept whether they have special ed service, need special ed services or not. We take in all of those students, and we do our best collectively with public tax dollars to support those schools. Now, I have no problem with folks who say, well, we need some changes, we need to transform schools. If they want to do that, work with us, and we can do that. But this idea that you're going to somehow give folks choice, we know from the way it's implemented in other states that what happens is you can just raise the tuition and the amount that you're giving out these dollars, and a lot of it ends up going to upper middle income or wealthy families who don't really need those funds. So you're essentially giving a coupon to families who don't really need it to send their kids. And the other piece that I think maybe you can speak on is it feels like it's a way to resegregate schools, and is underneath all of it. What are your thoughts on sort of what I just said? And
Yeah, I mean, there's so many pieces of the puzzle, and it's almost like I'm having deja vu here. That's frustrating, and you and I are saying the same things we've said 100 times. It's like, why don't people? What is it that we're missing here? And it made me think. We're not missing anything. And you mentioned Neil Collins earlier. He's not missing anything. Rural Republicans, like, this is not a D versus R. At least it shouldn't
right,
be a D versus R issue. Like, you look at the state of Tennessee, you look at the state of South Carolina, you look at the state of Texas, right? It is the rural Republicans that stood in the breach that stopped these vouchers from crossing the finish line because they understood there was nothing in it for their communities. They insisted they wanted investments in their local public schools. And I was the one that said, look, if you don't get that and you're a rural Republican, ask yourself, when was the last time they bought a new bus in your school district? When's the last time they laid a new brick in your school district? When's the last time you had a fully staffed and credentialed teaching staff in your district? And if the answer is not recently, then you should be, to use a Southern term, mad as a hornet that the state legislature is spending all of its time not addressing the bricks, not addressing the buses, not addressing the mental health counselors, or staffing, they're running around, and doing flips trying to get vouchers through. And so people like Neil Collins get it, and a lot of rural Republicans in Texas get it. But you know what? Those rural Republicans get in response for standing up for public schools, they get primaried.
Right.
Governor Abbott held 4 special sessions this past year, would not let the legislature go home because they refused to pass his voucher bill.
Yeah, and I see that and Neil's been attacked. I've seen him attacked on social media as well, and he's been very good about standing up for himself and standing up on this issue, not caving, which I have tremendous respect for. It is a very difficult political climate, but it feels like this is something that's been building for decades. And for me, like when I talked to J.R. Green, who was superintendent of Fairfield County, you talked about how like decades ago, when Nation at Risk came out, that there was this sort of like attempt to frame public schools as failing, and that the blame it on teachers unions and start to undermine the public trust in public schools, and that didn't work enough. So he had to keep finding new things, whether it's CRT or woke, or they're indoctrinating your kids. Now they're grooming your kids, and there's pedophiles. I mean, it's gotten so crazy. The rhetoric has been so, to me, out of bounds and unfair. But it feels like they finally hit home with this message of indoctrination, and there's Marxists at your school, and we need freedom, and enough people have bought into that. But I think that your point is well made, that these folks who voted for that are gonna see that, oh man, this was not a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, 2 pieces, and I don't want to skip over the race piece, which you mentioned
Right.
earlier. There is a sorting function that happens in these private voucher systems, which is people are now allowed to retreat to their own racial silos, to their own culture silos, to their own religious silos. Right? Public schools are, since their inception, about sort of the common good, and we haven't always lived up to that, but that has always been the purpose, the bringing the many together, right, as one. And now what we really have is a system of public finance and support to fracture the many into separate different groups. And I think that is incredibly dangerous for democracy. And I talk a lot about that in Schoolhouse Burning. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a danger moment, not just for our schools, but for our democracy. And so yeah, I mean, the ramifications of what we're doing are enormous. So sorry for going back to your earlier question, but I just wanted to make that point.
No, that's great. Um, so do you see this sort of racial component that I see to it? That, I mean, that there are these communities where after there was integration, you saw in a lot of these rural communities these private schools spring up, and a lot of white folks sending their kids there, and then the public option becoming primarily people of color, and now they just want a way to pay for it? Or do you see, am I overstating that case? Like what is the racial component of the voucher scheme?
Well, so I think there are at least 3 different components. And again, I sort of try to deal with all of that in Schoolhouse Burning a few years ago. So there's the racial component, right? Which is we have a history in the South in particular of using the private schools as a way to avoid desegregation. And of course, South Carolina and Virginia and others tried to voucherize public education in the 70s to avoid that obligation. The Supreme Court, United States Supreme Court, struck that down for reasons that aren't really that applicable today. So that limit is not there anymore. But the Supreme Court saw what Southern states were doing quite explicitly and said, you can't do that. And so I think, yeah, there's still some of that legacy that hangs on, right? That if you look at a national map, what you see is that privatization doesn't actually really exist in predominantly white states, right? There is no privatization in North Carolina, in North Dakota. There's no privatization and Oklahoma. Well, now there is in Oklahoma, although there's getting to be more diversity there. But but you go to our states with the highest levels of white students, there's no privatization. the more students of color that are enrolled, the more there's privatization. So you have that connection. There's also the religious connection, right, which maybe overlaps with the race a bit, but there is this belief that our schools are too secular, that they're too anti-religion. I don't believe that, but that's the Betsy DeVosses of the world that believe that, and also believe it's their obligation, to create God's kingdom through the schools on earth, and they want the state to help support that. So that's the second piece. But then there's a third piece, which is just anti-government. Right. So if you're anti-government at the federal level, you're anti-Social Security, you're anti-Medicare, you're anti-Medicaid. If you're anti-government at the state level, then you're anti-public education, because that is the largest line item ticket that states have. And ultimately, if what you want to do is reduce your taxes at the state level, you need to get people out of the public schools. You need to get them off the public dollar, right? I mean, that's the other thing. You can take these vouchers. There's no guarantee it's going to keep up with inflation, or, as you noted earlier, cover the cost, right? And so I think we have at least those three things. And then we added a fourth thing, which is the cultural war. I mean, those three things I just mentioned, to be clear,
Mhm.
were insufficient during 4 years of the Trump administration to make anything happen at the federal level, and really to make anything happen in most states. But after January 6th, right, school choice and vouchers became ideology. They became cultural ideology, which is what
Right.
you're mentioning earlier, that there's the indoctrination, there's this, there's that, and other. And it actually was that cultural ideology that put them over the top. Because if you're a rural or if you're a regular Republican, like, you can say, yeah, I don't really think we should be separating ourselves out into separate schools, or, yeah, we've got Sunday school on Sunday, we'll take care of religion there. We don't need to undermine our schools. Or maybe, look, we can afford to support our schools. But when it became this cultural, ideological issue, you're no longer welcome as a Republican if you don't buy onto that cultural, ideological issue. And that's what has put them over the top in the state houses.
Right. I think that's a perfect analysis. And I was thinking about, I think that from a political standpoint, the people who want to get in and dismantle public schools so that they can profit from them, the way we do with our medical system and a lot of other sectors of society, they see a sort of a profit motive there. Like, if we can turn this into a money making scheme, then that's great. So I think there are some people who are pure libertarian who believe that philosophically, but I do think what drives a lot of this is just money, and they don't really care what tools they use to get it done. I don't think most of them even believe that schools, Miss Smith third grade classes indoctrinating kids into Marxism. But if they can lie enough and spread it out through social media and make people believe that lie enough, and just keep hammering away at public trust in public schools, and get them to be suspicious, then the passage of these voucher bills, it becomes a little bit more palatable, a little bit easier to do. And I feel like one of the things that makes me most angry is when folks who clearly just are about the profit motive, or like, as you mentioned, promoting their own particular religious worldview, will use this idea that school choice is really about supporting kids in poverty to get them out of their failing schools and give them a choice. It's like framing vouchers as a tool for getting young people out of poverty seems so cynical to me. I don't know how you feel about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, we can look at the data, and you alluded to this earlier. Look at the data in Arizona, and I don't have the specific numbers on the top of my head, but I want to say 57, 60 some odd percent of the people receiving a voucher in Arizona right now are either already in private school to begin with before they received one, or they're, non-low income, right? And so this is not somehow or another vastly coming to the benefit of low income students. There's another piece here which I think is important for the public education project. Let's imagine for a moment that what we do is we peel off a huge portion of the wealthy people and the middle income people from our schools, and our public schools become the place where only poor kids go, where only low income kids go. Because again, that's the natural result here, given the way, given how much is covered, and given the fact that most of these private schools don't want to educate kids with more needs. If our public schools become the place where only poor, uh, low income, black and brown children go to school, the public education project, as we have known it for the last century and a half, is over and it will not come back. And I'm not trying to be overly dramatic. I mean, we used to have what we called pauper schools, pauper, in a lot of states. They were always underfunded. There was always public support problems, right? Because they were charity programs. So if our public education system becomes a charity program for low income students, you know, we'll give whatever we feel like is appropriate. Instead of giving what students need, we'll give the crumbs that's left over, right? And it'll be characterized as welfare. It'll be characterized as charity. And the idea that there's some sort of constitutional obligation is going to go out the window. Now, that may mean full employment for people like me, who will then find themselves constantly fighting in courts. But I will say there's only so far upstream you can swim, right? That if the
Mhm.
state goes that far, like, how do you fix something that becomes that broken, where only poor kids or only low income kids go, because everyone else is left and abandoned it and doesn't care anymore.
Yeah, I mean that seems to be the end game, from what I can tell. Uh, J.R. Green was saying that he thinks this is like just the first step. Let's convince people that vouchers are a good thing and it gives them choice, and people get these education savings accounts or whatever, so they get this money and start sending their kids to private schools. Then you're gutting the public school, and then the public school will eventually collapse. The system will eventually collapse, and then they eventually do away with the vouchers, because then that's socialist, right? We're not going to give you money to send your kids to school. You figure it out yourself, the way you do your medical bills and everything else, like the way you do groceries. It's like you said, it'll be crumbs, it'll be scraps at best. And so I find that just to be in a country where we have four billionaires who control as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the population. It seems unconscionable and immoral that we would implement a system where the ultimate goal is to gut one of the most foundational parts of maintaining a democracy and trying to build some kind of equitable society, and give folks opportunity. To me, it's so essential that we fight back on this.
Well, I will say, I guess I'm stating sort of a doomsday scenario. I mean, I do think the chickens will come home to roost. The question is, how much damage is done in the meantime, right? Because at the end of the day, 90% of the people in this country went to public school, graduated from public school, right? I think we have a lot of people deluded about the path that we're taking, somehow not really thinking that we're putting the system at risk. But when our rural communities get squeezed even more than they are now, when our suburban schools, right, suddenly have a very different experience, and you buy a house in a nice, suburban school, and all of a sudden that school is also struggling, right? There's going to be huge political consequences for that, because I don't think that most Americans, nowhere near most Americans, are okay with that. So those chickens will come home to roost. But again, the question is, how much damage are we going to do between now and then? And I'm confident they'll come home, because, to be clear, we went through a version of that during the Great Recession. I'm not pointing fingers about, there was a global recession. There was a lot of challenges, but this, South Carolina state capitol experienced the largest public protest in the history of this state because of the nature of school funding in 2018, 2019. And that happened from West Virginia to Kentucky to Arizona to Oklahoma over and over again. So those chickens will come home to roost. There's going to be a lot of suffering in the meantime. So you just got to hope that people of good faith and goodwill recognize that before things get too bad.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. I think that's like a pendulum, and it's swinging so far in one direction right now. But I don't think folks really understand the ramifications, and it is a shame that if we're unable to defeat these voucher schemes, the damage that's going to be done in the transitional time. But I do think eventually we come back to our senses. But it could take years, a generation, for us to get back to it. I don't know.
Well, and to be clear, and I think this is an important point because we get caught up in the moment and we can't remember the water that's passed under the bridge. But I
Right.
mean, one of the reasons why we're here in this moment, one of the reasons why some people have frustrations with their public schools, to be quite honest, is the decade of damage that they experienced after the Great Recession. Right? I
Mhm.
mean, well, a lot of schools had lost 15, 20%, of their budget during that period and couldn't make it up. And so, yeah, there were real deficiencies in that school. And those deficiencies become the basis of complaints, and complaints become the basis of saying, well, maybe I should get a voucher instead. Right. And so, um, and as a result of that, we decimated. I know preaching to the choir here. We decimated the teacher pipeline across this country, right? In the
Mhm.
state of California, right? This isn't a red or blue issue. This is a financial consequences of the Great Recession. State of California, as of and something like 2012, they used to be graduating, I think, 2 or 3 thousand new certified teachers a year, and that number had fallen down to 600 or 700. Right, it was like cut by 70%. Right, and those numbers didn't come back. Right, because those people had been told there is no future, there are no resources for this pipeline, and so people made economic decisions and went in other directions. Now, as my friend Peter Green always reminds me, he says we don't really have a teacher shortage. We got plenty of people who are willing. They left the classroom. They could come back if we created the right decision. But nonetheless, the ranks of teachers who are willing to hang on, and do the good fight and stay committed to this mission, it did shrink, right? And a lot of them are not coming back. Maybe some of them could if we moved in the right direction, but a lot of them are just not coming back. They moved on to different lives.
Yeah, and I think, having been in the field now for 30 years, one of the things that I think's happened is the sort of the test and punish, sort of paradigm that we've been in, that's just kind of gone on steroids, where now we have scripted curricula and sort of a paint by numbers approach to teaching. I think has pushed a lot of people who are willing to deal with some of the funding issues or lack of resources, or stagnation in wages, where some folks are willing to deal with that. But now you're coming in and you got someone from the district office telling me I've got to go by this pacing guide and I can't do the creative things that I wanted to do with my students. So there's that component of it as well, where testing just sort of became deified. And I think a lot of educators saw that as a form of malpractice, and also wanted to leave because of that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you saw it or heard about it, but Peter Duffy at the College of Education here, probably about 6, 7 years ago, he did this survey of all of South Carolina's teachers, and he got back, it was a qualitative study just to see what people felt about various issues. And so he took this sort of enormous database of the feelings, emotions, experiences of South Carolina teachers, and he used them to write a play that had real lines that people had spoken. And so I watched that play, whatever year that was, 5 years ago, and I got stressed out watching it. It's like I know it, but as a non K through 12 teacher, to sit there and watch this story that's built around a couple of different teachers at different stages of their career, but one of them, is a brand new teacher, and he comes in, and of course he's excited and wants to connect and with students and make a difference. And this like big sort of binder of curricula and standards gets dropped on his desk, and things like this just keep, he's just so overwhelmed, um, and distracted from doing the important work of relationship building, the important work of building trust with students, because it's a bureaucratic exercise. And I'm not, I'm not trying to discourage you. You people know better than I do, but as I was just talking to a colleague today that she's an educator, and I said, look, I've done a lot of social science and policy writing in my day, but what matters most are individual relationships, right? I know in my life, having someone who believes in you, or as I say in Schoolhouse Burning, believes in you more than you believe in yourself. Someone who, you know, touches you on an emotional level that maybe you break down and cry about. I mean, I remember moments of breaking down in front of my teachers and and feeling loved by them, by the words that they shared and that they really cared about me. And those are the things that make a difference in children's lives. But the problem is we have increasingly built a policy apparatus that prevents those things from happening. Well, you're probably not supposed to touch kids anymore. People are probably getting uncomfortable hearing me talk about crying in front of a teacher and a teacher comforting me, right? You might get taken to the jailhouse for that now. But in any event, right, we really have an environment that sometimes I think is at odds with doing the things that children need most to succeed in life and in school.
Absolutely. Well said. I want to give you an opportunity to talk about the book, your most recent book, and I'll put it up here for those. You can find it on Amazon. I don't know where you prefer people to purchase this, but it's called "Dangerous: Learning the South's Long War on Black History." And as I was preparing for this live stream, I was thinking about asking you if you want to sort of talk to folks about what the book's about. But I wanted to connect this history of Black literacy and the book bans, and also the sort of desire to strip the curriculum of some of the stories that are really, I think, are important for young people to know about the history of racism, the history of segregation, like the things like the Tulsa Massacre. Uh, and I think there's this idea that if we can just, I think there's this idea with some folks that we just need to focus on the positives of what America's been. Yes, we've had these issues, but America's a great country, and there's nothing really to look at from the past. We need to move forward and be patriots, and this sort of whitewashing of history. So I'd like you to talk about a little bit of how the book and the history of Black literacy in the South, and then what you're seeing today in terms of book banning and curriculum control.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. Interesting point you make about focusing on only the good. I mean, this book has went through a couple of different titles before it landed on Dangerous Learning and the South's Long War on Black Literacy. The first title of this book was Freedom's Line, and the point was that access to education, access to literacy, the building of the public education system have for the last 2 centuries been freedom's line for Black people in America. And this goes back to uh, pre-Civil War, right? And that's a triumphant story. Of course, it's the line of freedom because there's someone standing in the way. But this I started this book as like this is really inspirational. I wanted to talk about people overcoming the odds. I wanted to talk about secret schools. I wanted to talk about the first freedmen schools in South Carolina, and I do all those things. And I think, these are testaments to human spirit. These are heroes that we all should be proud of. And it didn't matter to me what your race or ethnicity, right? This is part of our culture. I mean, I mentioned earlier in this conversation that we have a constitutional provision guaranteeing public education to every child of every race, religion, socioeconomic class in the state of South Carolina because of the Black leaders who came out of those freedmen schools. They are the ones that pushed public education into existence, right? And so everyone's heritage dates back to the passion that Black people had for education in the state of South Carolina. So that's not something that we need to be ashamed of, right? I mean, that's a wonderful, positive story. Now, you can't tell that story, though, without talking about those who tried to create barriers. And I think what you really have in my book is an incredibly balanced story. And to be crystal clear, I don't paint all white folks as demons in this either. I mean, one of the most eye-opening aspects of writing this book for me, was the diversity of thought amongst slaveholders, right? I mean, we have this monolithic vision of every slaveholder committed to the institution, uh, uh, with violent aggression and doing what must be necessary. But in writing this book, I discovered, for instance, in the state of South Carolina, there was a leader in the South Carolina Georgia Synod of the Presbyterian Church that, he said, look, I enslaved however many people, but I am not going to stop teaching them to read and write. I believe it is my Christian duty to share the word with them. And if that ends up leading to the end of slavery, then it's God's will. I mean, this is a slaveholder saying this, right? Complicated man, obviously, enslaving people, but yet willing to extend God's word and accepting that might lead to the end of slavery. In the state of South Carolina, we had religious leaders in the upstate that delayed the criminalization of literacy by a decade because they insisted the same thing as this man. It's like, you folks in the coastal areas may be committed to the criminalization of Black literacy, but we're not going to allow it, right? And in Virginia, right, we had the legislature of the General Assembly of Virginia, after Nat Turner's revolt, spend several weeks debating the abolition of slavery. Now, some people will tell you that was never going to happen. And that's probably true. But to be crystal clear, there were 3 different votes taken to shut down the vote, to shut down the debate, because they said this is a dangerous debate and we are not giving up on slavery. And they didn't have the votes to shut down debate. So that tells you that this issue was complicated, right? Now, again, I'm not trying to sing the praises of any particular person in the South, but the point is that, it's a rich, complex history. And when we come to it with this idea that we must interpret it in one single way to make, that damns everyone or frees everyone, we're doing an injustice to the real people that lived through that. In the state of North Carolina, I'll stop going, but this is all part of the narrative in the book. In 1829, there were either 1,200 or 1,600 members of the Anti-Slavery Society of North Carolina. Let me repeat that word, 1,200 or more members of the North Carolina Anti-Slavery Society. I'm guessing that it is news to most people that such a thing even existed in the state of North Carolina, much less had well over 1,000 members. But what happened, and I think this ties us to the current moment, what happened over the course of a decade was the South became radicalized. It became overly ideological, such that 8 years later, there were only 8 people who showed up at the North Carolina Anti-Slavery Society meeting, and they never met again, right? And they radicalized to shut down newspapers from the North. They radicalized to criminalize Black literacy, right? They radicalized to rewrite history books, to take out books from schools, right? And so the South goes from a place that's at least trying to struggle with what the future should be to one that seals its fate because the most ideological, the most regressive portions of society determine that no thoughts other than the ones they decree to be in favor of slavery shall be discussed in the state of South Carolina.
I think it's so important for educators in particular here in South Carolina to understand the history and sort of connect these dots to where we are currently. And I don't think we do that. I think sometimes you mentioned before we play this game of whack-a-mole. I think we play it on our side too, like where, these problems come up and we're so busy trying to put out these individual fires and try to fight against these individual bills that we're not really seeing where this all came from. And I was thinking about how, I think it was 1954 that South Carolina passed the Right to Work bill. Then in 62, I think it was that they adopted the Confederate flag to be flown over the State House. And then in 1967, we had the Black and white teachers organizations come together and form SCEA. And it was only a few years after that that there was an anti-union, we'll just say anti-union organization created, and I think that there has been this sort of created division amongst educators to prevent them from having any real power. And I think a lot of this goes back, and I think a lot of this goes to the idea also of creating division over these cultural, social issues, so that folks who really want to make money and profit can pass bills that they wouldn't normally be able to pass, because, like you said, they don't really benefit uh, people who are the middle class, or people who are struggling financially. They don't, but they're able to get people to vote against their own interests in some cases by concocting these culture war issues. Um, I don't know. What are your thoughts on all that?
Well, I mean, look, it's it goes without saying that it's complicated, but I want to put two ideas together, which I think relates to the question you asked, which is my point earlier, which is that the Republican Party is not doing what Republican voters want them to do, right? So, yeah, I'm not going to give all voters, Democratic or Republican, a pass, but you do have people on both sides of the aisle who want a future that the party is not delivering for it, right? So that's point number one. And the question is, well, then why not? Because you said, they're voting against their interest. And I think the answer there, it's not the same as 1840 propaganda in the South and silence and censorship and all that. But we do have a weaponization of ideology that's happening in our society right now. And if you're a lifelong Republican, there's no place for you in this
Mhm.
party if you don't adopt the party line. There's no place for you as an education leader, Republican education leader, or nonpartisan leader if you're not speaking the party narrative on history, on vouchers, et cetera, et cetera. And so what you really have, and this is what I think is so dangerous about this moment, reflects back then, is that it's not just that we are chilling speech. We're certainly doing that, but we are coercing, right, conformity, right? I mean, it's one thing for us to not talk about things in public anymore. Okay, whatever, we talk about them at home, right? I mean, there's a negative effect of that, but we are coercing conformity in
Mhm.
politics right now. And that means, right, that people may not have free choices anymore, right? Now you could say, oh, well, there's D's over there. Well, let's be clear. I'm not here. I'm a nonpartisan critic. Like the Democratic Party, not to the same level. I don't want to equivocate, but there is ideological coercion there too. Maybe not in the South Carolina legislature because it's a small group, but there is at the larger levels, right? And so we are increasingly becoming a political society right now where I fear for our ability to make rational decisions. I fear for voters in terms of having options that actually reflect their personal desires because it's being captured and dominated by ideology.
Yeah, it feels like it's there are orthodoxies on both sides. And then the politicians who don't conform strictly to the orthodox positions on both sides are excommunicated. It's very much like a dogmatic religion at this point. And that what that does is it funnels people into having particular worldviews that help them advance politically, but may not be even what they genuinely believe in. And I find that to be dangerous. I think that there should be a marketplace of ideas from around the entire political spectrum, and nobody should have to kowtow to a person or a party. That we should have, be able to be free and independent to a degree. I mean, whether you're to the left or right, to hold those opinions and not feel like you have to conform. I think
Well,
that's a good point that you
yeah, I
make.
mean, one of the conclusions that I reach in the book, and I try not to beat people around with conclusion. I mean, this book is a story that I think that people tell me is at least very readable, and some one person on public radio told me it made her proud to be black to read this, which I was quite honored for her to say that. That wasn't my intent, but to try to meet someone at that level. But I think there's a lot in here for everyone. That's the point. But the line that sticks with me, and one of the few conclusions I try to put in the book is that the South sealed its fate for war, not in 1861 when the first shots were fired, but in the 1830s when it criminalized Black literacy. It censored newspapers such that even white people didn't have the freedom to read what they wanted to read in the South. And then in the 40s, it filled that vacuum of silence with propaganda, right? That there was no way that this issue was going to end in anything but bloodshed because it had lost the ability to see straight. It sealed the deal 3 decades in advance. Now, I'm not telling folks we're heading for civil war here, but because a lot has changed, and I talked through that. But we are, as we march closer and closer to that orthodoxy, as you talk about, we are sealing the deal for I don't know how to describe it. I'll let the readers, the listeners, decide for themselves what we're sealing the deal for.
Yeah, it feels like just a deep division that's almost irreconcilable. And yeah, it's a scary thing to watch because there's always been division, and that's okay. But it feels now it's just been accelerated through social media, and I don't know how AI is going to impact either. AI is going to help us find a way out or make it a lot worse. I haven't figured that out yet. I do want to give you an opportunity before we close out our conversation. First of all, let's just bring the book back up. The book Dangerous Learning: The South's War on Black Literacy. You can find that on Amazon. Do you have a website folks can look at as well?
Yeah, I mean, DerekWBlack.com has my books and some events and things like that on there, and some other podcasts if folks want to listen to them. So yeah, you can get more than you want of me if you go to DerekWBlack.com.
Okay, I'll put that website up. So that's DerekWBlack.com for folks who'd like to. I think that let's just go to the website and order the book from there. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to share before we sign off?
Well, only because I don't, I sort of we went to a very dark place there, and I hate to end that way. I mean,
Right.
there is this other thing that's worth noting, and as you mentioned, AI and this. I mean, part of what is leading us to this moment is new technology. And anytime humans experience new technology, it has an enormously disruptive and unpredictable impact, right? We could go back to the late 1800s when we had more newspapers in circulation than any other period in history. That actually was a disruptive moment. There's no gatekeepers on information. Now everyone has information. There's a lot of nonsense in there, right? And there's a lot of that moment that feels similar today, right? Our new technology is social media and the internet and AI. And, humans are always going to struggle to adapt. But I think the aftermath of that period in the mid 1800s were incredible institutions that have served this country for a century. The New York Times, the Atlantic, um, state newspapers, the Tennessean. These institutions come out of this huge noise of information in which there was nothing reliable, right? It was just competing narratives. And so, right now we have lots of different voices. We're here, right? Having a conversation, an unfiltered conversation, and hopefully it's worth listening to. And people are having other ones that are, maybe not worth listening to elsewhere. But I think as we grapple with this technology, hopefully, right, we will follow a good path of the past, which is we build something stronger and better for our democracy. I'm not smart enough to know how we do that. I can't see into the future, but there is reason to believe that we can harness these new tools that move us to a better place. But we are experiencing extreme growing pains right now that are pushing us to our limits.
Well said. Well, Derek, thank you so much for your time tonight. It's been a great conversation. I really, really am glad we were able to connect and set this up. And I'd be happy to have you on again. Anytime you write a new book, I don't know if you've got another one in the works, but anytime you do, love to have you back on and continue the conversation. There's a lot of areas we didn't get to cover, but really, really fascinating conversation. And I appreciate your voice and what you're trying to promote in our state. And as a Gamecock alum, really proud to have you on, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
All right. All right, everybody. That's Derek Black. Again, in case you missed it and you'd like to learn more about his work, you can go to derekWblack.com. You can order the book there. He's got a couple of books, and feel free to contact him. Appreciate his time tonight. I do want to mention a couple of things before we sign off. Coming up next week, a week from tonight on Wednesday, we're going to have a conversation with this panel about the SCEA's Praxis Initiative. And we are going to be launching some resources for folks who are struggling with passing the Praxis. So if that's you, or you know somebody who's struggling, and you just want to learn more about what we're going to be offering, it's next Wednesday at 6 o'clock with Tiffany Kane, Carissa Martin, Laquita Maxey, Teddy Meyer, and Mary Rita Watson. We're going to be talking with folks from the NEA, Study.com, and the SCEA. The week after that, on the 12th of March at 7 o'clock, we're going to have a conversation with Anya Gizis and Jeremy Thompson from Good Jobs First. We're going to be talking about tax abatements, and that may not sound super exciting, but it's actually really important because how we deal with corporate taxes as they move into the state of South Carolina has an impact on how we fund schools. And these folks are some of the experts on that information. So it's going to be really important for folks to tune in. We also have coming up, we have Cool Coaching. Every Tuesday and Thursday night. This is free. It's one-to-one online support for induction teachers. If you're in the early part of your career and you just need some advice, some support, you have some questions, need some tips, every Tuesday night and Thursday night from 6 to 8 o'clock, just go to cool.us/coaching. Angie, Stephanie, and Marcella, some of the best in the state to provide you some of that coaching support that you need. If you know somebody at your school who needs support, please make sure they're aware of this resource. It is free. You do not need to be a member of the SCEA to participate in that. If you are interested in joining us for our Educator Wellness Retreat, a couple spaces left for our June retreat, and about 8 spaces left for our July retreat. These are science-based, secular, trauma-sensitive retreats, specifically for educators in South Carolina. You must be a public school educator, and that includes anybody who works in a public K-12 school. They can join us, education support professionals, anyone who works in a public school. It's in Old Fort, North Carolina, a beautiful place called Indigo Nature Retreat. You can learn more about that at cool.us/retreat. And one more thing, that I want to let you know about is Alex Del Castillo does something called Cool Yoga. And every Wednesday night, in fact, I think he did it tonight. He does it on Instagram Live. Head on over to the SCEA's page on Instagram. You can try out yoga for free. And we have free yoga resources on our website at cool.us/yoga. Well, that's all for tonight. Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, thanks to my guest, Derek Black. We hope that everybody will pitch in with us to push back against these school voucher bills. And no matter what form they take, we need to protect the institution of public schools. We need to fight back against privatization. It really doesn't do anybody any good other than those who want to profit and those who are already well off enough that they can afford a private tuition. It's essential, if we want to protect democracy and protect public schools, that we all use our voices and speak up. So I hope that if you have not already reached out to your state representative, that you will do that and speak out, speak loudly, and speak often so that we can push back these bills. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next Wednesday.